Excuse me, everyone, I have a brief announcement to make. Jesus was black, Ronald Reagan was the devil, and the government is lying about 9/11. Thank you for your time and good night.
You're having that dream where you made the white people riot, weren't you?
But I was telling the truth.
How many times have I told you you better not even dream about telling white folk the truth? You understand me? Shoot. Making white people riot. You better learn how to lie like me. I'm gonna find me a white man and lie to him right now.
I am the stone that the builder refused. I am the visual, the inspiration that made ladies sing the blues. I'm the spark that makes your idea bright. The same spark that lights the dark so that you can know your left from your right. I am the ballad in your box, the bullet in the gun, the inner glow that lets you know to call your brother son. The story that just begun, the promise of what's to come. And I'ma remain a soldier till the war is won.
All right, well, hi everybody, we're back here, and today we're going to be talking about the current situation and the current circumstances in Colombia. If some of you have been paying attention, there has been a social movement that has sparked throughout the country in places like Cali, Bogota, Medellin, and others. And in response, the police have responded how the police responded to many social movements with repression and other forms of violence, including the disappearances of many people. So today we'll be talking to someone from the Red Condor Collective, and we're gonna let them introduce themselves, however they want to introduce themselves, and also their organization, what the goals of the organization are, and you can take it away.
Hey Alejandro, thanks. My name is Juanes from the Red Condor Collective, and we started last year, May 2nd of 2020. Around by like a dozen Colombian different activists just in the diaspora across from the UK to the US. And, first, I guess it's important to recognize that like our diaspora has been spread pretty thin globally due to just like the social conditions in our country. And it was a lot of like the motivating factor as to why we thought we should have our collective as a way to support the people back home. And so it was kind of out of a sister organization with Anticonquista, which is this other decolonial media project that we formed.
Great, and thank you for introducing the Red Condor Collective, and we'll be plugging them more throughout the podcast, so more people can go on their podcast on Spotify and learn more about it as well.
I can elaborate a little bit. So we have our Instagram page, the Red Condor Collective, but we also have our website, thediasporatribune.com, which also has its own Twitter page where we put out regular news pieces about what's happening in Colombia and analysis as well. And then we also have our podcast, the Red Condor Hour, where it's semi-new. We started back in February, but we bring people on and interview them for different topics and really trying to emphasize this lens of land justice, indigeneity, agrarian reform, reparations for Afro-Colombians and so forth. And so we've been diving into that. And our project in general, as the Red Condor Collective, we have this, the goal or the aim is to really provide material and non-material support for the communist movement and just general like activists in Colombia. Before the April 28th strike, we had raised about like 10,000 funds for different campaigns, whether it was to support like an economically unstable Afro-Colombian lender Renteria, and from the Buenaventura struggle, or also just fighting for the legal rights and raising money for the legal legal defense for Colombian protesters last year in the September 9th wave of police repression and protests. So we've been really just trying to provide support. And since the April 28th strike that happened, now 11 days ago, It's been, we've collected $44,000 US dollars in support of people on the ground. And we're really, I guess, excited and like proud of the way that our diaspora is really trying to show up to support people. They're really understanding the gravity of how people are being murdered by the state and trying to advocate and provide support that the ways that they can. And so, we're really just like thankful for all the people that have donated. We have a list of groups that we're sharing that like we're donating to, and also with GoFundMe, we've signed like these like anti-perjury like things to show that we're not at all profiting from these funds. These are being shared with people on the ground that provide medical aid for when people are facing serious injury, that are providing legal defense, that's trying to provide food for some of the autonomous groups that are forming on the ground right now. So again, just expressing our thanks and showing where our money's going right now.
Yeah, no, and in terms of like where we're coming from, I guess the quote unquote first world or heart of an empire, right? And many of us, no one signed up to be born here necessarily, right? Many of us coming from Latin America, a lot of it has to do with displacements. A lot of it has to do with the lack of accessible jobs. So no, I mean, I'm happy hearing this because like in this practice of like decolonization, it's kind of silly to think this sort of like big rebellion is going to come from the quote unquote first world. Whereas like, I guess if we study Latin American history, we see like Latin Americans, Africans, Southeast Asians, mobilizing for what's theirs. Right.
For sovereignty.
Yeah, exactly. Because things have been set up a certain way. But like, do you want to expand on like the diaspora element? Like, is it hard finding other Colombians to organize with, like where you're at, or like how do you all kind of like internetwork? Like, if you do want to talk about that, and like especially in the U.S. from like the U.S. to Colombia.
I can elaborate a little bit. So first of all, it's important to understand that there's so many of us that have been displaced out of our country, whether immediately from violence or just because like the social mobility in our country has been so stripped by like the hands of like, global interests on our natural resources. And so I think there's over 8 million people that are displaced outside of the country, including 1 million in the US alone. And then 6 million people that are internally displaced. People that have been kicked out of their campesinos, their farmlands, and forced into either prisons or into the cities to live in poverty. So it really does make like stable housing and like being connected to a land like consistently like a really hard obstacle. And a lot of us in the diaspora have like experienced that immediately too. I was born in Medellin, but who knows how many times I've moved, kind of like throughout the States growing up, just, kind of like in that brunt of moving into a country and not having economic stability. So, my own experience kind of like attesting to that sense of displacement and lack of connection to like a family home or anything. But as for how that plays into our organizing and how we've been built up, we did get to start on like a good foot. There was like a bit of like a focus on anti-conquista. There were like some specifically Colombian people a part of the team that really wanted to build this collective out. And so it was with them and just putting out a call for like other Colombians that have, we've had a lot of people kind of come and go, work with the project, write for us, but like, people have varying capacities and different jobs, and like we're all, participating in this as like volunteers. But we found like really like great, consistent people that are actively contributing, and really, I think we're all like continually seeing like the power and like the benefit and what we're able to do as a group from outside of Colombia. And so I think it's just been through a lot of our personal networks have been flexed too. I know I've gotten to kind of loop in some of my Colombian friends that I've met here and just, struggle and movement work into the project too, which always feels like, it's great to see the Red Condor Collective continue to grow, and a lot of, I think, for as Uribista, for as liberal that the Colombian diaspora can be, there are also a lot of people that are really, I guess, like enamored by the idea of social change and know that it's, we have like a shared responsibility for like trying to make that change happen. So, we're really thankful for those people.
Oh, yeah. And in terms of the situation in Colombia today, I mean, I understand it's stressful, and I understand it's emotional, especially with tied to the people, tied to the land. But I know we can talk about it for hours in terms of like legacies of colonialism, but in terms of like introducing the listener podcast today, or wherever they're coming from, like how would you synthesize what's going on right now in terms of social movement, in terms of police repression? How do you introduce people to it, and how, like, just to make people aware of the current situation in Colombia?
Sure. Yeah. We can start with the current situation, all of which is like emanating from the April 28th strike, El Paro, that happened, and the way that it has continued, even past certain, like, quote unquote wins, because El Paro no para, it doesn't stop. And the strike was originally formed because of a tax reform bill that Duque, our president, was trying to pass, which was going to raise the taxes that the working and middle class pay to 19%. And that was going to be 19%, like a raise of 19% on services, that are essential, like water, electricity, and also on goods like meat, eggs, gasoline, internet, etc. And I think it was May 3rd that they said that, that they were going to rewrite this tax reform, but there's also other reforms that they were trying to pass, like on the health system. The health system they're currently trying to privatize, and very much like model it in the way that the US has privatized their healthcare, and have now this like really big reliance on insurance premiums, and really revoking people's access to public healthcare. So there's current reforms that are like along those lines, and also reforms that are going to challenge people's access to their pension and retirement and have them taxed at higher rates. So really putting like the brunt of Colombia's global debt and corruption onto the working and middle class. So people have been mobilizing, really out of like frustration with that over the last like 11 days now.
And if you wanted to expand on that aspect of international debt, like I think a lot of listeners, maybe it'd be useful to learn about maybe the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, and like what that does to Colombia, because in situations like Jamaica that have also experienced like a massive debt that the World Bank has pressured them to like cut off social services, similar to Mexico in the 80s, similar to Brazil in the 80s as well. Do you want to expand on like how the IMF, how just sort of neoliberalism has led to where Colombia is now in terms of policing, in terms of repression, in terms of how people are organizing on the ground?
Yeah, definitely. So maybe first to start is on this debt piece. I brought that up because Duque had mentioned that, like, because of the economic instability that was brought on by the COVID-19 crisis, that was kind of like one of the leading factors for why this tax reform bill was being formed, as a way to kind of trying to recover from this, I guess, a bit of like a recession, economic recession after the pandemic, even though the pandemic is still actively going on. Crazy enough, like, today's Mother's Day, and I called my great grandma and just found out that they're currently, a few of them got COVID. And so, and for so long, for a long portion of time, we've had access to the vaccine here in the States, and it just feels really tangible, like just the way that the first world continues to really strip like access to vaccinations and money and resources to the people, in the third world and Colombia. So on this debt, though, or I guess let's look at neoliberalism, the way that it's grown, it definitely began to escalate in the 90s in Colombia, where the Colombian economy began to, literally abandon people. There were hardened penal policies. There were multiple new offenses in the penal code, and it also like escalated the penalties for like minor infringements on the poorest populations of Colombia, which has very large sections of Afro-descendant and indigenous people. And so it put all of these like new stressors to continue to abandon and like criminalize them. And and then once we add Plan Colombia onto that, that was kind of like the US's attempt to accelerate neoliberalism down there. There's a lot of like global interest in Colombia as a stepping stone into Latin America, and also maybe as a metaphor that might be helpful to some, it's also referred to as like the Israel of Latin America for the way that it's being used to kind of invade and step into Latin America as a whole, and for Southcom and stuff like that. The U.S. military plan to continue to kind of maintain a control over South America. And so anyway, with Plan Colombia, some of the big sectors of it were, quote unquote, to prevent drug trafficking and to prevent the violence from the armed conflict. But really the solutions that they offered and they funded were just the growth of policing and the carceral landscape in Colombia. For some examples, after Plan Colombia, we saw the implementation of ESMAD, which is like the SWAT equivalent in Colombia, which uses like these legacies of counterinsurgent like urban guerrilla fighting, and brought it into the city to then be able to enact the very like violent repression that we see now, that we're currently seeing in Colombia, but also that we saw here in the States last year during the George Floyd uprising with the use of rubber bullets and tear gas. And in Colombia, the police know that they can move with more impunity, and so they even use live arms, like balas, like guns, live guns, to shoot and kill people that are protesting. And so with Plan Colombia, we got this implementation of ESMAD, but we also saw the arrival of like the U.S. prison model into Colombia, where not only were people being displaced by violence, but as they were being abandoned, and we saw like the degradation of different social projects, like the minimum wage and other things that would protect their labor. Otherwise, we instead saw for example, the Colombian prison population increase fourfold, from 94, from when I kind of mentioned that neoliberalism started to really get a grasp on Colombian politics, to 2013, it increased fourfold, from 29,000 people in prison to 120,000, which is a gigantic boom.
Oh, yeah. And in terms of here we're learning a lot about U.S. involvement, imperialist involvement in Colombia, but I'm curious, how is the left mobilizing throughout Colombia, whether that be today or whether that be throughout Colombian history? Because there seems to be the Colombian state as well as the U.S. imperialists have the idea that there's drugs coming out of Bogotá. There's drugs coming out of Cali. So, can you expand on the role of this sort of idea that Colombia is a narco state similar to Mexico, or can you identify how is the left mobilizing to counter some of the shit that the right is doing? Because there's U.S. involvement. There's sort of a fascist mobilizing throughout Colombia as well. So how is the left responding to these issues? And if you want to expand on that.
Sure. I'll start with how what the general left, or just popular response has been, and then I'll get into narco trafficking. And so, just generally different popular fronts, from Quibdó, from Buenaventura to Bogota, like from all across the country, people have been advocating for like sovereignty and autonomy, trying to, and against corruption. Definitely very large lines against corruption, because people know that the politicians in Colombia often very much get to profit by being sellouts, by selling out the country and its natural resources to global interests, to people that profit, and to a very select few hands that continue to accumulate wealth in Colombia, and then all the multinationals that get to profit off of our land. And so people have always advocated and tried to form different forms of like labor rights, different unions, and then in turn, face a lot of violence and just like union busting nonsense in response to their organizing. And there's so many examples to come across, but I think the one that has been really standing out most to me lately would be, for example, looking at La Minga and organizations like CRIC, which is the regional council of indigenous. What is the word?
I kind of familiar with it. Like they kind of like work with like the NASA, like they kind of operate out of like a larger indigenous coalition, essentially.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just like struggling to translate acronyms, but it's like the Regional Indigenous Council of Cauca. And they have been really forming like this political line about the fact that we need to resume a sense of work that is communal, that we need to stop working for national corporations, and we need to have ways that we can sustainably be pursuing like agrarian reform, and where we're no longer producing cash crops. We no longer have our eyes on like sugar and coffee and bananas, but instead we're growing the food to be autonomous and have the opportunity to feed ourselves and to be able to have a self-sustaining economy, because right now our economy is completely just oriented towards global interests and people that want our natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead.
And how strong is the sort of, I don't want to say indigenous movement to make it monolithic, but how strong is the sort of like a militant left indigenous movement in Colombia, even a black movement in Colombia? If we think about the number of Afro-Colombians who live in Colombia as well, and if you, like, does that, how does the state negotiate with them? Is repression targeted to their movements specifically, or are they sort of ignored by the state? Are they kind of kept out of things? Maybe similar to other circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it definitely the Afro and indigenous struggles in Colombia are mostly just ignored and repressed, especially in internal media, but also in the different forms of Western media. They don't get reported. And that's a bit of the gap that us at the Red Condor Collective try to fill, and in terms of really, providing some eyes and support for people like in Buenaventura, for example. And I think something that's a bit emblematic of like how strong and important the Afro struggle is in Colombia is the fact, it's just what's happening in Cali right now. Since the strike, 47 people have been assassinated by police and other, forms of like paramilitary and just like extrajudicial violence. But 75% of those have happened in Cali. And Cali is like the largest city in Colombia with a concentration of Afro-descendant people, which we can't ignore. Like the reason there's like this big concentration in Cali is because of paramilitary violence. Paramilitaries are like allowed to control certain regions. They are often in collaboration with a lot of different officers and military personnel in Colombia, and they get to therefore really assume control in areas that are ignored by the state, which is really often like the Pacific coast, where the majority of our Afro-descendant people are.
And could you expand on like what a paramilitary represents, or just like how they operate? Because I think a lot of people in the U.S. are kind of like unfamiliar with it, even though we're seeing a rise of paramilitary groups, especially right-wing paramilitary groups in the United States. But can you kind of like introduce our listeners to what paramilitary groups do, like where they stem out of, how they contract with businessmen and stuff like that?
Yeah, most definitely. This is going to be a bit of a lengthy answer because there's so much to say. But paramilitarism in Colombia really started in the 60s in response to the formulation of groups like El FARC, where it was literally out of like U.S., I guess, encouragement and advisement. Like the U.S. Colonel, I think his name is Lansdale, and other U.S. officials that were saying like, you know, hey, you need to like repress your left movement that's currently militarizing. And so you need to find ways outside of your national army to, you know, violently attack them. And so there became like this kind of like insertion of a lot of the same arms that were used at the same time in the 60s, you know, in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. And all those arms were also the same ones that were using Colombia and given to the Colombian military to use against our, like, you know, militarized people. And I guess to then elaborate, or I guess the line that I really want the listeners to understand is that the lines are extremely blurry and inexistent between the Colombian military, police, and the paramilitary groups. You know, there are very often people that are just completely in both organizations and operate within both of them, but also for those that are not in immediate collaboration, you know, they're often bought off and get to profit from the paramilitary money to promote, work with, support their acts of violence. Some of these examples, just to really be like specific with y'all, is that paramilitary groups often, you know, like communicate via radios with Colombian military and police. They use telephones, beepers, the sharing of intelligence and names to try to like identify guerrilla collaborators. They often like share like, you know, different processes, and they'll like collab on like a raid, for example. And the state is so enabling of them that like often, you know, the most that they're regañados, the most that they're like scolded is just for leaving bodies on the street instead of like disappearing them. And it's pretty hard to quantify the amount of violence that we really experience at the hands of paramilitary groups. I wish I had some stats for y'all right now, but even then, the stats that do exist are just it's very hard to understand, you know, who was disappeared and who was a victim of paramilitary violence, because paramilitary groups get to move with such impunity that like if they even just suspect or think that someone's aligned with a guerrilla group, that they will kill them blindly and murder their family, threaten their family, and or push them towards like expulsion from their communities, forcing them to kind of recede into like different like forms of jungle life and stuff. And so paramilitary groups are just extremely repressive, and a way that the Colombian government can, you know, have like this extrajudicial armed force throughout Colombia.
Yeah. And like, just for the listener, whether they're listening here in the United States, I think a lot of times it's hard to think of what the fuck a paramilitary group is, but I guess an example we can give from the United States is essentially KKK. And like there is no coincidence that like these fucking lyrics by Rage Against the Machine say like, you know, the same people who work forces are the same people who burn crosses. Like there's this element that like they're separate from the state, but at the same time they're still serving some type of state interest. All right, like there's still police who operate as these quote unquote paramilitary groups. And in terms of like where these guns are coming from, the U.S. has to look at itself a lot too, because these arms are coming from U.S. programs, right? And this is beyond Colombia. This is in Afghanistan. This is in Syria. This is in Guatemala, which caused a large genocide of indigenous people there as well. So I think just for the listener to kind of give like some context, but I think your definition is perfect. And
I do want to add just a little bit more, because it's not just the U.S. It's also the way that the U.K. As another like large, I guess, think tank for like the Western global interest, or like hub for it. For example,
Israel, right?
Yeah, all of these, and then we look at the way that UK was one of the main like investors and like helped enact NAPCA and invade Palestine for the creation of Israel. So it's all these connections. But I wanted to point towards a recent report that was put out by the Canary UK on the UK's College of Policing, where they showed that over like the last few decades, they were actively training officers in Colombia on like counterinsurgent practices, quote unquote. And, realistically, they did this, and also in the military they did this to continue to protect their global interests, particularly in petroleum, and I wanted to dive into like this like connection with paramilitary in the UK a bit, with this example of terror that happened, like on behalf of the company called Ocensa. Ocensa was like Colombian like petrol company that British Petroleum BP is like a shareholder of. And between 1985 and 2015, over 3,000 union activists were murdered, and additional 6,000 people were disappeared in the Casanare region where Ocensa was operating. And BP was sending over 2 million a year in a 3-year agreement with the Colombian defense to create like armies and, fund weapons to explicitly just like defend these oil rigs, because often a goal and like a line of different left guerrilla groups in Colombia have been to, interrupt these lines of profit. And so to try to like, destroy these rigs and obstruct ports and, just try to preserve the natural resources of Colombia and make sure that they're being used for Colombia and not for global interests. And so we can really look at that like relationship between BP and paramilitary groups and the terror that was happening for like 2 decades in Casanare as like an example of the way that paramilitaries profit from multinational corporations and their interests and are the armed force for them. And there's a lot of examples. There's also the way that Coca-Cola like hired paramilitary groups in the 80s to kill union leaders in some of their factories throughout Colombia. And I don't know, the examples go on and on, but paramilitary groups exist to really preserve the capitalist like grasp on our natural resources and labor.
Yeah, and it kind of gives context to why a group like the FARC, like the ELN, why guerrilla organizations in Latin America and in other places throughout the third world have mobilized, right? Like, I think a lot of times they're seen as this sort of like boogeyman, but like, with this context that you're giving, like of like what Coca-Cola is doing, what BP Oil is doing, what other international groups are doing, like sometimes we got to say shit like make it make sense, but like this is what like what y'all's platform is doing in terms of like providing a light in terms of like indigenous and Black Colombian movements, and because it's being ignored by like popular media. But no, if I think those are excellent examples, and in terms of like how do paramilitary groups influence today's mobilizations, whether that be in Cali or in Bogota?
So that, I think, it's also a bit hard to grasp, but just, as I said before, like the lines between paramilitary and police and ESMAD and the Colombian military, those lines are so thin that, it's kind of a bit impossible to really grasp like the level of which paramilitary groups are really present. Also, they are formally considered illegal as of, I think, like 1989 or something like that. They did get to operate legally, different paramilitary groups for around 20 years, but they have since, continued their like illegal operations. And So yeah, and also like the state is not going to immediately like quantify, the amount of their military members that have been proven to have been a part of like different paramilitary groups and stuff like that. It's going to try to protect itself in the way that it's seen, especially in this line of like trying to paint all victims of the armed conflict as victims of guerrilla groups and not paramilitaries. They try to say, oh, these guerrilla leaders are terrorists and that they're the people who are killing and kidnapping. But the armed conflict is a lot more complex than that. And they continue to try to erase those lines of like what the paramilitaries are responsible for. And so, we have to kind of keep that obscure. I can't even think of the word obfuscation, like the blurriness. We have to keep that blurriness in mind.
And in terms of like what's going on in Colombia today, like what do you think comes out of this? Like, are you surprised by this? Like in terms of like the amount of repression, but like what do you think is the outcome at the end? And I know it's a hard ass question, but like, and you can take your time answering it. But like, in terms of like Colombian history and like the patterns you see, like is there some sort of like, does it become co-opted by the state? Do things become more localized? Because I see protests. The way people are protesting they're protesting in a more localized fashion in Colombia today. So if you can expand on like where this goes.
Sure. So first on co-optation, there are definitely really large liberal lines with Colombia that, is trying to argue. I've been a bit annoyed with them too, because they keep just trying to argue like, people are protesting just about the presidency, even though that's not true. Like, it's about how oppressive the state is, but they try to belittle the protest into just being about presidential elections. And then they say like, and what about like all the congressional seats, and we need to be focusing on them and be present at these elections, and like kind of trying to belittle and again, like infantilize like what the movement is really about, which is about sovereignty, autonomy, and like having the ability to like live like unrepressed lives, and so there's definitely a lot of lines of like that are trying to kind of regularly what was the word that you use, co-opt, co-opt the movement. And as for how people are responding and like what response can continue to look like, I think we can continue to have our eyes on groups like La Minga, El Creek, and also just like different autonomous, like unnamed groups. A really, I think, beautiful example. We have a video up on it on our Instagram. But there's this like youth-led group in Porta El Mar in Cali, where it's a like kind of I think blockade is the word for like how they're restricting and kind of opening up like walls around their community and making sure that, they're not getting the same kind of drive-by shooting and violence and unmarked cars that have been perpetuating violence. And they're like, holding tolls without collecting funds, but they're holding tolls to try to make sure that, they're not going to continue, they're not going to experience the same violence that's happening all throughout other regions of Cali. And they're one of the few regions to have not had any deaths. And so, it really shows that like they're there to set up their own way of like community defense and also community nurturance, because they're hosting, communal dinners and like cultural activities and forms of like community building that are trying to heal and make sure that people are nurtured through this movement, so I think if we look at examples like that, it really shows the beauty of what can like happen when people are in arms. And they had a really like beautiful quote. It was like something along the lines of like, cualquier organización popular va a ganar contra el Estado, or like any like popular organization will win against the state, because like it's with the people, it's with popular fronts that we win, And So we had to look along those lines. And then there was another part of your question I'm trying to remember.
I think the other part of the question was kind of like, sorry if it's a bad question, but it's kind of like, where does it go from here? But like, I think you're kind of foreshadowing, like, it can go to a more like local communal like practice where like a lot of people can learn from, not just Colombians. Like a lot of people can be benefiting. But if you wanted to go on that, like where you think it might go from here?
Hopefully the direction continues to be set towards, the building of like popular power in Colombia, and like our ability to like kind of change these structural and like the state structure and the way that it oppresses us, and it's just oriented towards global interests, And so I don't know. It's also like your kind of questions bringing up for me like these like lines of like how vandalism is being a bit like not being a bit, but it's being criminalized and like also like demonized in our country. But people do not, a lot of people, especially along like liberal lines, are like not understanding that vandalism and the burning of police precincts and the changing of like the policing landscape in Colombia is important for us to progress, that we need to eliminate the way that the state is actively killing us for us to be able to, resume and make it sustainable, that we maintain our popular power, because otherwise we're just going to face another wave of repression and social leaders will continue to get killed. Just today, we found out that we had like our 60th social leader murdered of this year. Her name, lo tenía escrito, I had it written down. Here we go. Yeah, she, Beatriz Moreno Mosquera. She lived on the Pacific Coast and was one of like the union leaders for workers of education. And she had like a long legacy of working for just like teachers' rights and education of Afro-Colombian people. And she was found murdered with signs of having been tortured in Colombia, and we need to kind of recognize like the way that the state is responsible for that violence and how we can prevent it from continuing to happen.
Yeah. And no, I mean, as someone who's Latin American history, I mean, obviously like there is some like benefit to me saying like, yeah, everybody like, let's look beyond the US, right? But like, what I really appreciate about this interview and about this discussion is that you really bringing in a lot of like themes that are common throughout Latin America, and to me it's extremely unfortunate and it's very, very depressing. But it's also, I think you're also reminding people that there's a broader story beyond the U.S. Especially when we think about political struggle, when we think about the violence of police. And you look at cases in like Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Brazil.
Or Brazil. Brazil right now, they had, there was a police raid that like killed 25 people in a favela, making it one of like the most like lethal, like it's just alongside Colombia for one of the more legal like assassinations by the state or massacres by the state in this year.
And you bring something up that's super critical is how do we prevent this, And that's the big question. Obviously, like we all want to answer, but like there are some available answers, right? There are kind of like these communal practices. There are like organizations to be militant, to be prepared, but also to be aware that the right is a super violent, fascist, like I don't know, group of fuckheads that are armed, and like. And this is necessary to think about. Whether you be in the U.S. and you think that gun laws are going to protect you, there are organizations forming here, and but no, I mean, I think I don't know. I'm kind of running out of questions, but this is a really good discussion. But I sort of like wonder, like, what more do you want people to take away?
I think we should look at the way that we look at crime in general. I think I'm a bit biased in my perspective on like abolition and what it means to dismantle policing internationally. But I know that if we were to look at poverty as a causative factor for crime, and try to actually resolve poverty and oppression, and look towards forms of community sustenance, mutual aid instead, that we would then, be resolving the crime that happens if we, built movements that were relational, and where we were in deep relation with the people that we lived around, and the way that we produce food, and the way that we then defend ourselves. We would have like more sustainable movements, and we would be less, susceptible to the hands of capitalists and those who really focus on accumulating their wealth. And an example that we can actively try to build towards that right now is some of the mutual aid lists that we're collecting, and that we're I can give you this link to one of our documents, but we've been in conversation with a bunch of different groups, some of which we are giving money to, but so many others of people that are just, trying to build funds to, start community fridges, create LGBT resources, and place for like unhoused queer people in in Colombia. And, there's a lot of different forms of mutual aid that are trying to pop up as people are trying to support themselves in Colombia. So you can help these projects really start off by donating to them or donating to our group, and we are sharing group, that money with groups. And also, I guess, looking towards, quick pause.
Yeah.
I don't know where else to go.
No, I'm going to follow up with another question. Then, I want to ask, and this is one of my biases too. I come from like an internationalist angle too. But what is the significance of like participating in a solidarity effort outside of the U.S.? What role does internationalism play in the political struggle that you're interested in? And I guess for you personally, what does being internationalist mean? What does performing or what does giving solidarity to a place outside of the country that you're currently in mean? And what role is it going to play in the broader struggle of whatever the fuck we're trying to do here?
Mm-hmm. Well, to be, internationalist is to just have a very practical understanding of how our opposition is organized. They are organized internationally and are actively always collaborating on their forms of repression, and I think a really good example of that is just the connection between Colombia and Palestine, for example, where in both of these colonial projects of Israel and Colombia, the U.S. is injecting money to extract a military. How do you say it? It's both places are very beneficial toward their military positioning in these regions. And so they inject a lot of their money and weapons and helicopters and tear gas, other forms of state repression to continue to maintain the grasp on both of these locations. And so just as people are facing displacement throughout the Pacific coast, and the Afro-Colombians in Colombia, is the same way that right now Israeli settlers are trying to claim Morehouse and evict people from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah in Palestine, in occupied Jerusalem. So it's really understanding the shared oppressor in all of these scenarios. And also, I don't know, there's just a level of being informed and being honest with how the wealth is really being accumulated in such few hands that it's global, it's international, and so we ourselves need to also assume those forms and know our enemy really well, and stand with those that are facing similar things and strategize with them and form relationships that are we can continue to exchange tactics and ways of mobilizing and protesting. Something that's been actually really beautiful to see is I've seen now in these wave of protests in Colombia, I'm seeing a lot of the same graphics that were used during the George Floyd uprising, teaching people how to protest and stand up, being translated into Spanish and being really shared pretty successfully throughout Colombian people everywhere. I see they're having this form of cop watch and recording that they're all documenting dates very consistently. They're all really they're informed. The protests are being extremely informed, and they're really building a politic on like how to contest like police repression. And we're all learning this like internationally together, and like we're only getting stronger, you know. So it's that's the point of like solidarity marches.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that explanation. And
on the solidarity march line, we also have a document on the Red Condor page, but we might have removed it, but I'm going to send you the link, and maybe you can put in the show notes, where we have the Red Condor Collective kind of put together a list of demands, some active statistics that we've been updating, and kind of like a bit of a survey of what's happening in Colombia, along with a list of chants, so that people can host their own solidarity marches internationally.
And then when we think about like the situation of like awareness, like this is necessary, like these solidarity efforts. And I just want to plug in the Red Condor Collective again. If you want to stay or just kind of like announce the Instagram page again and the website, like where people could get more information. And and I guess one little history thing too is for people interested in Colombia is just go look at how like the country of Panama was formed. And then maybe they can get a little more context to like how long the U.S. has really been there. But yeah, you can take it away.
Yeah, I think just on like this line of like Panama, I guess I'm going to just point y'all's listeners to the Red Condor Hour. We do dive a bit into like, you know, the original plan for Colombia, like El Gran Colombia by, you know, Simón Bolívar when we were first fighting for independence. And we also kind of like earlier today, we were talking about just the importance of like the indigenous movement there now. And we dive pretty far into it in our episode on the indigenous formulation of the communist movement in Colombia, our second episode on the podcast. And so just encouraging y'all to like listen to those if you're looking for more information. And then also the our socials, just at Red Condor Collective. I think it's at Red Condors on Twitter, and us and a lot of the organizations that we're working with, we can all be kind of connected through on those pages.
Dope. All right, we're gonna conclude it there. I'm gonna go ahead and press pause. But thank you again, and
thank you.
Yeah.
I know some of y'all here today because y'all think jail is cool. But see, y'all wouldn't know nothing about that. I ain't cool about jail, nigga. I've been here 10 years, and I ain't never getting out. Never. I ain't do much, just kill somebody. It ain't like the nigga ain't have it coming. He sure did. See, y'all think it's just about us in here, but this is about an oppressive system designed to keep niggas down. Y'all wouldn't know nothing about that. What about you, little nigga? You know about that?
Yes.
Oh, you know about that? Tell me what you know about that. Tell me what you think about that.
The prison industrial complex is a system situated at the intersection of government and private interests. It uses prisons as a solution to social, political, and economic problems. It includes human rights violations, the death penalty, slave labor, policing, courts, the media, political prisoners, and the elimination of dissent.
Nigga, did you just say what I was trying to say, but smarter?